Something extraordinary has been unfolding in the global economy, and most people have been watching the wrong headline. While the news cycle fixated on each individual tariff threat and each bilateral confrontation, a far larger shift was quietly taking place. Country by country, alliance by alliance, trading bloc by trading bloc, the world has been engineering its way around American economic dominance. And at the center of that shift, helping to give it language, strategy, and momentum, stands a Canadian Prime Minister who once ran a central bank. The question is not whether this realignment is happening. It is. The question is how far it goes and what it ultimately costs everyone involved. To appreciate the scale of what has changed, you need to understand what the American trading system actually looked like before Donald Trump's second term began. The United States accounts for roughly 8.4% of global exports and 14.5% of global imports. For 75 years, it sat at the center of an architecture it largely designed: the World Trade Organization, NAFTA, USMCA, bilateral investment treaties, preferential trade agreements, and a network of alliances that gave American companies privileged access to markets on every inhabited continent. The dollar underpinned all of it. Because global commodity markets, from oil to grain to metals, were priced in American currency, every nation on earth needed dollars to participate in the global economy. That need for dollars created structural demand for American debt, which allowed Washington to borrow cheaply and project financial power far beyond what its domestic economy alone would justify. This was not an accident. It was a carefully constructed system, built over decades, and it made the United States the indispensable nation in global commerce. But the system depended on something that economists rarely quantify and politicians rarely acknowledge: trust. It depended on the belief that Washington would honor its commitments, act with a degree of predictability, and treat its allies as partners rather than competitors to be squeezed. When that trust holds, the system self-reinforces. When it cracks, the effects compound. And in 2025 and 2026, under the weight of the most aggressive American tariff regime since World War II, the cracks became fractures. The numbers alone are striking enough to demand attention. According to the Tax Foundation, the Trump tariffs of 2025 represented the largest American tax increase as a percentage of GDP since 1993. The average effective tariff rate rose from 2.4% in 2024 to 7.7% in 2025, the highest level since 1947. In February 2026, the Supreme Court ruled in a 6-3 decision that the administration's use of the International Emergency Economic Powers Act to impose those tariffs was unconstitutional, forcing a partial rollback. But the administration quickly replaced them with new tariffs under different legal authorities, maintaining a substantially elevated trade barrier. According to J.P. Morgan, tariff costs that businesses absorbed in 2025 are now being passed on to consumers, with businesses shifting roughly 80% of the cost to customers in 2026. The Yale Budget Lab estimated that all 2025 tariff actions combined pushed food prices up 2.8%, with fresh produce rising 4%. Motor vehicle prices rose 8.4% from the cumulative tariff impact, representing roughly an additional $4,000 on the average price of a new car. The Tax Foundation calculated that the tariffs amounted to an average tax increase of $1,000 per American household in 2025, with further costs to come in 2026. The manufacturing sector, which Trump's tariff strategy was explicitly designed to revitalize, lost 77,000 jobs between April and December 2025. Total construction spending on manufacturing declined from $230.9 billion in January 2025 to $196.2 billion in January 2026. The reshoring that was supposed to materialize was not materializing, and the countries that were supposed to capitulate were not capitulating. They were adapting. But the real story of what those numbers triggered in the rest of the world is where this becomes genuinely historic. The first major signal came from inside the Western alliance itself. When Trump threatened 8 NATO member nations with escalating tariffs over Greenland in January 2026, those 8 countries issued a joint statement within hours, standing in full solidarity with Denmark and Greenland. The EU called an emergency meeting. France pushed to invoke the bloc's anti-coercion instrument, a mechanism designed to allow the European Union to restrict American companies from public procurement, limit trade licenses, and shut off access to the European single market. Europe was not blinking. But the more consequential response was not European defiance in one specific crisis. It was a series of trade decisions unfolding simultaneously across the globe that revealed a fundamental reorientation already underway. In January 2026, the European Union formally approved its trade deal with Mercosur, the South American bloc including Brazil, Argentina, Uruguay, and Paraguay. The agreement had been under negotiation since 1999, a process of 25 years that had repeatedly stalled. Trump's tariff agenda, in the words of the Atlantic Council, provided the immediate impetus to get it done. The deal created one of the world's largest free trade areas. Then, on January 27th, India and the European Union concluded free trade agreement negotiations. European Commission President Ursula von der Leyen and Indian Prime Minister Narendra Modi both described it as the mother of all deals. It represented 25% of global GDP and covered a trading bloc of 2 billion people. Von der Leyen stated plainly that the EU and India were responding to the need to diversify their trade relationships in the face of uncertainty from the United States. The diplomat analyzed the deal's timing without ambiguity. India and the EU were sending a message to Washington that allies and partners will not give in to threats of tariff wars and weaponizing trade. And then there was Canada. On January 16th, Mark Carney flew to Beijing and signed what he called a landmark agreement with President Xi Jinping, opening Canada's market to Chinese electric vehicles in exchange for the restoration of canola and agricultural market access. Within days, Trump threatened 100% tariffs on all Canadian goods if the deal proceeded. But the deal had already been signed, and Carney's response was measured, precise, and revealing. Canada, he said, had no intention of pursuing a free trade agreement with China. The arrangement was entirely consistent with USMCA obligations. It was, in his framing, a correction of specific trade distortions that had developed over the previous 2 years. But what Carney was also doing at exactly that moment was laying out a broader architecture. At Davos on January 20th, he called on middle powers to act together. He proposed that Canada broker a bridge between the European Union and the Comprehensive and Progressive Agreement for Trans-Pacific Partnership, the 12-nation Indo-Pacific trade bloc that had itself been formed after Trump withdrew the United States from the original Trans-Pacific Partnership in 2017. Carney described the potential alignment as a trading bloc of nearly 1.5 billion people. He was not proposing a bloc against the United States. He was proposing a bloc that did not need to depend on the United States. The Carnegie Endowment for International Peace analyzed the proposal in March 2026 and concluded that the logic was sound. The CPTPP and the EU already maintain free trade agreements with several of the same countries. Canada holds membership in both. Linking them through harmonized rules of origin and aligned regulatory standards was not a simple task, but it was a conceivable one. And the urgency of deepening supply chain networks with reliable partners had, in the Carnegie analysis, increased exponentially as nations sought to reduce vulnerability to coercion from any single dominant power. What is important to understand is the distinction between what is demonstrably happening and what remains speculative about where it leads. What is factual is this. The EU has concluded a deal with Mercosur covering more than 700 million people. It has concluded a free trade agreement with India, the world's most populous nation. It has a standing trade agreement with Canada, Japan, South Korea, and Vietnam. The CPTPP includes Australia, New Zealand, Singapore, Malaysia, Mexico, Chile, and Peru. Carney has explicitly proposed aligning these frameworks. None of these deals were primarily negotiated because of Trump, but the Atlantic Council, Carnegie Endowment, and Council on Foreign Relations all concluded in separate analyses that Trump's tariff policies provided the accelerating pressure that turned years of stalled negotiations into concluded agreements. That is the documented record. What remains analytical rather than certain is whether these separate deals will coalesce into a coherent alternative trading architecture. The Carnegie analysis was candid about the difficulty. Linking the EU and CPTPP would require resolving significant differences in rules of origin, regulatory standards, and sectoral sensitivities. It would face domestic political opposition in member states. It would not happen quickly. But what multiple respected analysts have concluded is that the direction of travel is clear, and that the cost of not pursuing it for the countries involved is rising faster than the cost of the effort. The BRICS bloc, meanwhile, represents 43% of global GDP by purchasing power parity and 55% of the global population. At its 2025 summit in Brazil, member nations noted serious concerns about the rise of unilateral tariff measures and advanced discussions on cross-border payment systems in local currencies that bypass the dollar-denominated SWIFT network. Gold reserves of central banks in emerging economies have been rising steadily. The dollar's share of global foreign currency reserves has declined from a peak of over 70% in 1999 to approximately 56% as of late 2025, according to the Atlantic Council. The pace of that decline accelerated in 2025. None of this means the American economic order collapses in 2026. That is not what the evidence supports. And it is important to be precise about what is actually known versus what is projected or speculative. The United States remains the world's largest economy. The dollar remains the dominant global reserve currency by a substantial margin. American companies remain the most valuable on earth. The demand for American goods, services, and financial instruments remains enormous. What the evidence does support is a different and more precise claim: that the range of countries and institutions willing to accept American economic terms without building alternatives has narrowed significantly, and that the process of building those alternatives has moved from conversation to construction. A 50% survey of German companies with U.S. business reported in February 2026 that they plan to invest less in the United States or postpone investment due to tariff policy uncertainty. Almost 70% of Americans in surveys predicted that 2026 would be a year of economic difficulty. Manufacturing, construction spending declined throughout 2025, despite the stated purpose of the tariff strategy. The costs were being absorbed, the alternatives were being built, and the countries doing the building were not adversaries of the United States. They were its traditional partners. That is ultimately what the past 12 months of global trade realignment tell us when looked at together rather than individually. Canada signs a deal with China. Europe finalizes 30 years of Mercosur negotiations in a single season. India and the EU conclude what they call the mother of all deals. 8 NATO allies stand shoulder to shoulder against economic coercion over a territorial dispute. Carney proposes bridging the EU and the Indo-Pacific into a 1.5 billion person trading bloc. None of these events, taken individually, topples the American trading order. But taken together, over 12 months, they represent the most significant collective movement away from American economic centrality since the post-war system was established. The mechanism is not hostility, it is insurance. Countries that once accepted the costs of dependence on American markets because the benefits outweighed the risks are recalculating that equation. They are not leaving the American orbit. They are making sure they have somewhere else to go if they need it. Whether the USMCA review in July 2026 stabilizes or further fractures the North American relationship will be one of the defining tests of whether this process can be partially reversed. What is clear is that the window to reverse it is not unlimited. Trade infrastructure, once built, develops its own momentum. Supply chains, once reconfigured, do not simply return to their original form because the political weather changes. The world that existed before Trump's second term is not coming back in the form it held. What comes next depends on decisions that are still being made. But the direction of the past year has been unmistakable, and Mark Carney named it before almost anyone else was willing to. The rules-based order is not declining, he said at Davos. It is over. What comes from the fracture is still being built. And how it is built, by whom, and on what terms, is the central question of the decade ahead.